In the long and distant past, before betrayal was whispered among the stars, before brother turned upon brother, there was an age remembered only in fragments of fading record and half-forgotten myth, a time when humanity first began to rise from the ruins of old night. For thousands of years, mankind had endured isolation. Worlds once bound together by science and reason had been cut adrift by warp storms and madness. Civilizations had withered alone beneath alien suns. Knowledge had dimmed. Faiths had twisted. Empires had risen and fallen without ever knowing they were not alone in the dark. Then, on Terra, cradle of the species, a single will endured. The Emperor of mankind had watched the long night of human history with a patience that no mortal could possess. He had walked among warlords and tyrants, philosophers and dreamers, always guiding from the shadows, always shaping events toward a future only he fully understood. And when the storms of the warp at last began to recede, when the stars could once more be reached, he revealed himself. What followed was not merely conquest. It was reunification. The unification wars forged Terra into a single realm under his rule, ending the era of techno-barbarian states and gene-wrought despots. From the ashes of those final wars rose the Imperium, not yet the vast and grinding empire it would one day become, but a vision clear and radiant. Humanity would stand together again. To carry that vision to the stars, the Emperor created his greatest instruments, the Legions Astartes. The Space Marine Legions were more than soldiers. They were symbols of a new age, warriors crafted from gene alchemy and relentless discipline, each legion shaped with distinct character and purpose. They were the mailed fists of unity, the guardians of a fragile rebirth. At their head stood figures even greater still. The Primarchs. Forged through arts that blurred the line between science and the unknowable, these beings were designed as exemplars of human potential, leaders, generals, and demigods in mortal form. Yet fate scattered them across the galaxy in their infancy, casting them onto distant worlds where they would grow amid alien skies and unfamiliar cultures. The Emperor did not abandon them. He went to find them, and so began the Great Crusade. It was an age of relentless motion. Expeditionary fleets pushed outward from Terra in shining armadas, their hulls bright with fresh heraldry, their holds filled with colonists, scholars, iterators, and warriors. Compliance was offered first through diplomacy, through shared history and the promise of reunion. Many worlds accepted with relief, having endured isolation and fear for generations. Others resisted. Against those who raised arms in defiance stood the legions. Drop pods fell like meteor showers. Armored columns rolled across alien plains. The sky burned with the passage of starships delivering orbital fire with precise and terrible beauty. War was swift, decisive, and, by the standards of the age to come, almost merciful. The Imperium sought not annihilation, but integration. World by world, humanity's scattered domains were brought back into the fold. With each victory, the dream grew stronger, and as the crusade advanced, the lost sons of the Emperor were rediscovered. On distant worlds shaped by hardship, each Primarch had risen to greatness in his own way, a king, a general, a liberator, a conqueror. When the Emperor came to them, he did not simply reclaim them, he welcomed them as partners in a grand design. Each reunion sent ripples through the Imperium. Each Primarch brought not only his personal brilliance, but a legion that felt, at last, complete. Among them was Horus. He was not the first found, nor the last, but there was a rare quality in him, a charisma that drew loyalty without effort, a warmth that balanced the stern majesty of his father. Where the Emperor was distant, vast in thought and burdened by purpose, Horus was present. He listened. He laughed. He understood the hearts of warriors. His legion flourished under his command, its victories many, its morale unshakable. In councils of war, Horus spoke with clarity and confidence. Among his brothers, he was often the center of gravity, the one who could ease rivalries and steady pride. He did not seek to overshadow them, yet many looked to him instinctively. The Emperor saw this. As the crusade expanded, its scale grew beyond even his immense capacity to command every front. The frontier stretched thin across the spiral arms. New threats emerged from the void, Xenos empires, ancient machines, and stranger things still. The Imperium needed a single voice to carry out the Emperor's will among the stars. And so, in a moment of quiet but immense consequence, the Emperor named Horus Warmaster. It was not a title granted lightly. It placed Horus above his brothers in matters of war, entrusted him with authority second only to the emperor himself. To many, it seemed a natural choice. To some, it stirred emotions more difficult to name. Yet in those early days, such tensions were faint, like distant thunder beyond a clear horizon. The Imperium stood at its height of confidence. Across compliant worlds, banners bearing the Aquila were raised over rebuilt capitals. Starports thrived. Trade routes reopened. Lost technologies were recovered and studied. Iterators, the Emperor's secular missionaries, spread the imperial truth, a doctrine of reason, unity, and the rejection of superstition. Humanity would no longer cower before the unknown. It would master it. The legions became legends in their own lifetimes. Stories of their deeds traveled ahead of them, of impossible sieges broken in hours, of alien tyrants overthrown, of lost human civilizations brought back into the light of a greater whole. To many citizens of the growing Imperium, the Space Marines were distant guardian spirits, rarely seen, always victorious. And above them all, though seldom present in person, loomed the figure of the Emperor. He was not a ruler who sought adoration, though adoration followed him nonetheless. His appearances were rare and often brief. He moved from project to project, from world to world, driven by plans that stretched far beyond the understanding of even his closest companions. There was always more to be done, more to build, more to secure. Some among his sons felt the weight of that distance. They were made to be mighty, yet still they were sons who had grown without a father. His approval mattered more than they would ever admit. A word of praise could be remembered for decades. A moment of perceived neglect could linger just as long. But such thoughts were quiet, buried beneath duty and pride. For now, unity held. Fleet after fleet sailed into the unknown under banners bright with hope. The stars themselves seemed to open in welcome. Every victory reinforced a belief that history moved in only one direction, forward, toward enlightenment, toward a galaxy where humanity would stand unchallenged and unafraid. It was a beautiful certainty, and like all certainties, it was fragile. In the depths of space, beyond the edges of newly drawn maps, strange regions remained where astropaths hesitated to gaze and navigators spoke in lowered voices. There were ruins that did not match any human design, and whispers in the warp that no chart could mark. These things were noted, catalogued, and set aside for later attention. The crusade had momentum. Its course would not be slowed by shadows at the periphery. Still, the shadows endured, not yet as enemies with names or faces, but as possibilities, the quiet reminder that the galaxy was vast, and that not all of it had been shaped for mankind's comfort. Yet in this era, such thoughts faded quickly. The Warmaster led from the front, his flagship a beacon among the fleets. His brothers ranged across the stars, each carving a path of compliance and glory. The Imperium grew larger with every passing year, its borders expanding faster than people could fully comprehend. To live in that time was to believe, with unshakable conviction, that humanity's destiny was finally within reach. And so the Great Crusade pressed onward, carried by faith not in gods, but in the strength of human will and the guidance of a single, distant emperor. It was a high tide of hope, the moment when the dream of unity seemed not only possible, but inevitable. In the quiet between campaigns, when ships drifted in formation and the stars burned cold and steady beyond armored viewports, there were warriors who allowed themselves a rare sense of peace. They had been made for war, yet they believed their wars would one day end, that they were fighting so others might know a gentler age. Such thoughts were not recorded in official archives. They lived only in private reflections, in the silence of observation decks, in the long, wordless gazes cast into the endless dark. And in that darkness, the future waited, still distant, still unseen, as the fleets of the Imperium sailed on beneath the light of a dream that had not yet begun to fade. Far from the celebratory remembrances that would later mythologize the early crusade, the reality of expansion was patient, methodical, and often quiet. Vast distances separated compliant worlds, and between them lay long stretches of cold transit where nothing moved but the slow drift of starlight across armored hulls. During these intervals, the Imperium was not a storm of war, but a network of fragile connections being carefully tied together. Astropaths whispered across the void, navigators traced shimmering paths through the warp, and logisticians measured supplies with almost devotional focus. This quiet labor formed the unseen foundation of unity, as vital as any battlefield triumph. Ships carried teachers, engineers, and administrators who would reshape reclaimed worlds into reflections of Terran order. Bit by bit, isolation gave way to structure, and structure to cautious trust. Few songs were sung of such moments, yet they defined the age. Empires endure through such threads. In council chambers aboard traveling flagships, remembrances recorded the words of commanders while literators prepared speeches for newly contacted populations. These men and women believed they were witnessing the final chapter of humanity's long fragmentation. They wrote of destiny not as prophecy, but as probability shaped by reason and strength. To them, the Emperor's design seemed self-evident, a rational galaxy, ordered and secure. Even the harshest compliances were framed as necessary surgeries upon a wounded species. Resistance was described as misunderstanding, rebellion as temporary confusion soon to be corrected. In such language, the crusade felt inevitable, its hardships reduced to steps along a straight and rising road. Few paused to wonder how vast roads might bend beyond sight. Confidence was the shared atmosphere of the fleets, as common and invisible as recycled air. The future appeared wide, bright, and welcoming. No shadow yet seemed large enough to cause concern. Among the legions, the rediscovery of each Primarch had reshaped entire cultures of war. Warriors who had once fought only for distant terror now carried the mannerisms, symbols, and strategic preferences of their gene sire. This transformation was not merely cosmetic, but spiritual in a secular and carefully defined sense. Each legion developed traditions, honors, and rivalries that gave color to the expanding war effort. Friendly competition spurred ever greater feats of compliance, as commanders sought distinction without openly defying unity. In triumphal halls, tallies of liberated systems were compared with pride that remained, for now, largely good-natured. At the center of many such gatherings stood Horus, whose presence softened rivalry into camaraderie. He praised freely, listened closely, and gave the impression that every legion's victory was shared. Under his gaze, differences seemed complementary rather than divisive, facets of a single, multifaceted purpose. Unity felt natural, almost effortless. Then, while the Warmaster's reputation grew, the Emperor himself became an ever rarer presence at the front lines. His great works increasingly demanded his attention elsewhere, in projects spoken of only in the most general terms. To his sons, this absence was understandable, yet it subtly altered the emotional gravity of the crusade. Where once his direct command had been a constant star, now his will arrive through orders, envoys, and distant extrapathic decree. Horus bore this responsibility with visible resolve, never voicing doubt, never allowing hesitation to slow the advance. To the fleets, the transition seemed smooth, a practical adjustment within an unstoppable enterprise. Yet authority, when concentrated, changes the shape of expectation around it. More decisions flowed through a single mind, more praise and blame settled upon one set of shoulders. In subtle ways, the Crusade's vast chorus began to align around one dominant voice. Few recognized the shift. Beyond mapped regions, exploratory elements continued to encounter civilizations that had developed along starkly divergent paths. Some welcomed reunion with visible relief, offering archives of lost history and pledges of swift compliance. Others possessed technologies or beliefs that clashed sharply with imperial doctrine, requiring firmer persuasion. In these campaigns, the legions were reminded that humanity's diaspora had not been uniform in its suffering or its solutions. There were worlds ruled by gene-altered castes, planets governed by machine intelligences, and societies built upon elaborate spiritual hierarchies. Compliance in such places was rarely simple, and the line between liberation and destruction could grow thin. Still, reports sent back toward Terra emphasized success, stability, and the steady spread of the imperial truth. Difficulties were footnotes, tragedies summarized in numbers that hid the human textures beneath. Distance made abstraction easy, and abstraction made sacrifice easier still. The crusade marched on regardless, without pause. As years passed, veterans of the earliest campaigns began to sense a subtle change in the emotional timbre of their endless war. Victories remained frequent, logistics efficient, and morale outwardly high, yet the memory of terror felt more distant than before. The Emperor was still revered, his vision still recited, but his physical absence had become the quiet norm. In that space, between devotion and distance, interpretation slowly took root. Commanders weighed not only what had been ordered, but what they believed had been intended. Such judgments were made with sincerity, shaped by loyalty and the immense pressures of galactic-scale war. No one imagined that interpretation itself might one day become a fault line. The fleets continued onward beneath uncounted stars, their course steady, their purpose unquestioned. In observation galleries, warriors sometimes stood in silence, watching constellations drift, believing dawn would last forever, and the darkness waited patiently. Beyond, that as the Great Crusade advanced ever farther from its point of origin, distance began to shape perception as much as truth. Reports that reached Central Command were polished by necessity, condensed into clarity, and stripped of the long uncertainties that marked real campaigns. A world brought into compliance in a single line of record might have endured months of negotiation, scattered uprisings, and fragile reconstruction. Yet across the widening Imperium, such summaries reinforce a single message. Progress was constant, resistance fleeting, and the Emperor's design unfolding with measured precision across the stars. Within the expeditionary fleets, life settled into rhythms that could almost be called routine. Muster drills, strategic briefings, and maintenance cycles repeated with steady reliability. For the Space Marines, whose existence had been engineered for endurance, this constancy brought a stern form of comfort. Each new system represented another task to be completed, another fragment of lost humanity to be reclaimed. The scale of their mission was beyond full comprehension, and so they focused on the immediate horizon, the next compliance, the next campaign, the next victory to add to their legion's growing legacy. Remembrances continued their work, documenting heroism in careful prose and luminous imagery. They believed they were preserving the birth of a golden age, and their optimism colored the histories they assembled. Scenes of reconstruction, of children watching starships descend in wonder, of former enemies swearing over beneath the Aquila, these became the defining images of the era. Harder truths, when recorded at all, were softened by language that emphasized necessity and eventual harmony. Memory itself was being shaped alongside empire, crafted into a narrative of inevitable ascent. At the highest levels of command, strategy grew ever more complex. Supply lines stretched across light years, dependent on warp routes that could shift without warning. Astropathic choirs aboard to keep communications coherent, their messages flickering through the immaterium like fragile candles in a restless wind. Every advance required foresight measured not in days, but in years. Horus proved adept at this vast coordination, balancing aggression with caution, ensuring that momentum never outpaced stability. His reputation as Warmaster deepened, not only as a warrior, but as a unifying mind amid daunting scale. Among his brother Primarchs, reactions to this new structure varied in ways subtle and rarely voiced. Some welcomed the clarity of centralized command, grateful to focus on their own theaters of war. Others, shaped by fiercely independent paths of power on their adopted worlds, found adjustment more difficult. Yet open discord remained absent. Councils were conducted with formal respect, disagreements framed as tactical debate rather than personal grievance. The bonds forged in shared purpose still held firm, reinforced by countless battles fought side by side beneath unfamiliar suns. Beyond the front lines, the imperial truth continued its steady spread. Iterators spoke in plazas and assembly halls, teaching that humanity's future rested not in superstition, but in knowledge and unity. On many worlds, these lessons found ready ground among populations weary of isolation and fear. On others, deeply rooted traditions resisted quiet erasure. Temples were reproposed, old rites discouraged, ancient symbols replaced with the sigils of terror. Such transitions were often peaceful, yet they carried an undercurrent of loss that official reports rarely acknowledged, a fading of identities too local to be preserved. In the void between stars, there were moments when even the most disciplined warriors felt the weight of immensity. Observation decks offered views of silent nebulae in distant galaxies, reminders that the Imperium, vast as it seemed, occupied only a fraction of existence. Chaplains did not speak of doubt, and commanders did not encourage reflection that might slow resolve. Yet private thoughts could not be regulated as easily as supply manifests. Some wondered what unseen forces had shaped the galaxy before humanity's return, and whether all of them would yield so readily to compliance. Still, momentum remained the defining truth of the age. Each year added hundreds of systems to imperial charts. Shipyards expanded, recruitment increased, and legions grew ever more experienced in the art of rapid, decisive war. Confidence was not mere arrogance. It was reinforced daily by tangible achievement. To most who served, the idea that this advance could falter seemed distant, almost illogical. History, at last, appeared to be moving in a single, deliberate direction, guided by will vast enough to encompass the stars themselves. And yet, beneath triumph's steady cadence, quieter currents flowed. Small misunderstandings, overlooked tensions, and unasked questions drifted like fine sediment through clear water, barely visible, easily ignored. No alarms sounded, no banners fell, no proclamations warned a change. The crusade sailed on in disciplined formation, engines humming with purpose, holds filled with hope. In that calm persistence lay both its greatest strength and its most delicate vulnerability, as the Imperium moved forward, certain of light, while distant horizons remained unwatched. In the widening sphere of the Imperium, authority traveled more slowly than ships of war. Orders issued from distant centers of command crossed light years through fragile astropathic relay, translated, interpreted, and enacted by those who would never stand in the Emperor's presence. This distance did not weaken loyalty, yet it changed its texture. Devotion once reinforced by proximity became an article of disciplined faith, sustained by ritual, memory, and the unshaken belief that every command served a design too vast for any one mind to grasp in full. Horus, as Warmaster, stood at the intersection of that distance. He received the Emperor's will as both instruction and expectation, carrying it outward to the frontiers where decisions could not wait for clarification. His burden was not simply strategic, it was symbolic. To countless commanders, his judgment represented the living continuation of the Emperor's intent. When he spoke, fleets moved. When he approved a campaign, entire sectors shifted toward war. Such responsibility settled upon him without visible strain, yet its gravity was constant and inescapable. Among the Primarchs, this new order required subtle adjustments of pride and perspective. Each at once ruled absolutely upon his adopted world, answerable to none until the Emperor's arrival. Now they operated within a hierarchy that placed one brother above the rest in matters of grand strategy. Outwardly, discipline prevailed. Oaths sworn to terror and to their father held firm. Yet in private reflections, comparisons were inevitable. Victories were measured, honors weighed, and the Warmaster's favor, though rarely requested, was quietly valued more than many wished to admit. The legions themselves mirrored these currents in quieter ways. Officers debated interpretations of doctrine, sometimes invoking the Warmaster's precedents to support their own approaches. Variations in culture, once simple expressions of Primarch heritage, began to influence operational philosophy more strongly. Through all of this, the Emperor remained a distant presence, his works on terror shrouded in necessity and silence. Messages from him carried immense authority, yet little explanation. Those who served did not question this openly. Trust in his wisdom were foundational to the Imperium's existence. But distance changes relationships, even those built on absolute loyalty. Without regular contact, understanding gave way to interpretation, and interpretation varied subtly from mind to mind, shaped by circumstance, pride, and the burdens each leader carried. So the crusade moved forward, radiant and relentless, while beneath its shining surface small uncertainties gathered like hairline fractures in polished stone. No single doubt threatened the whole, no single disagreement broke the bond of brotherhood. Yet across fleets and worlds, in decisions made far from terror's sight, the Imperium was learning to function without constant guidance. It did so successfully, even admirably, never realizing that this growing independence, born of strength and necessity, would one day change the meaning of unity itself. In the long passages between campaigns, when the guns fell quiet and the fleets translated once more into the shifting currents of the warp, a different kind of trial revealed itself. War was immediate, clear in purpose and resolution. Transit, by contrast, invited reflection. Starships drifted through unreality guided by the sight of navigators and the endurance of Gelair fields, their crews suspended in a realm where distance lost meaning and time felt uncertain. It was here, in these stretches of enforced stillness, that thoughts grew louder. For mortal crew, routine filled the hours, maintenance rites, data audits, prayerless observances of the imperial truth. For the legions Astartes, whose bodies required less rest and whose minds had been honed for constant vigilance, the quiet could stretch thin. Training continued, of course, along with strategic simulations and weapon drills. Yet even engineered purpose could not entirely silence awareness of the vastness surrounding them. Beyond the hull lay a sea no human empire could ever truly conquer, only crossed with caution and resolve. Remembrances often found these periods fertile for observation. They recorded conversations in dimly lit strategiums, sketched the solemn geometry of armored forms standing watch beside viewing ports, and wrote of the strange calm that settled over vessels between battles. Many believed such calm was evidence of confidence, a sign that the Imperium's champions felt no fear of what lay ahead. In truth, emotions among the fleets were more varied, though rarely spoken of in direct terms. Among veteran officers, memories stretched back across decades of near-continuous advance. They had seen civilizations crumble and others reborn beneath imperial banners. They had witnessed Primarchs reunited with their legions, and the Warmaster elevated above all in matters of war. These events had unfolded with such momentum that few had paused to consider their cumulative weight. In the quiet of transit, however, perspective shifted. The crusade no longer felt like a sequence of victories, but like a single, unending endeavor with no clear point of rest. Horus bore this awareness more keenly than most. As Warmaster, he reviewed reports from 100 fronts, balanced requests for reinforcements against finite strength, and judged which regions could be stabilized with diplomacy and which required decisive force. His decisions shaped the fate of systems he would never personally see. Those who met him during these journeys often remarked upon his attentiveness, his ability to make each commander feel heard. Yet beneath that presence lay constant calculation, a mind rarely granted true stillness. His brother Primarchs experienced the silence differently. Some embraced it as a chance to refine doctrine, to drill their legions into ever greater efficiency. Others turned inward, studying the cultures of worlds they had conquered, seeking patterns that might ease future compliances. A few grew restless, chafing at delay, eager to return to the clarity of battle where action drowned uncertainty. These differences remained private, expressed in habits rather than declarations, yet they marked how even demagogues could not share identical temperaments. Astropaths, linked mind to mind across impossible distances, felt the strain of the era in ways few others could perceive. Messages multiplied as the Imperium spread, their chorus growing more complex, more urgent. Through the immaterium they sensed eddies and disturbances that had no easy translation into words. Such impressions were passed upward in cautious language, logged as anomalies or interference. Rarely did they alter grand strategy. The Crusade's pace allowed little room for hesitation born of intuition alone. Within the holds of civilian transports, settlers bound for distant colonies spoke of opportunity and renewal. To them, the Imperium was a promise carried on engines of steel, a chance to build lives free from the isolation that had defined previous generations. Their optimism was genuine, yet it depended upon the stability maintained by fleets they would never see. The connection between soldier and settler, between conquest and cultivation, stretched thin across light years, held together by faith in a system still young. As ships emerged from warp into the cold clarity of real space, the silence of transit gave way to the immediacy of new objectives. Coordinates were confirmed, Auspex arrays swept unknown systems, and orders flowed with renewed urgency. Whatever doubts had stirred in quiet moments were set aside, replaced by the disciplined focus that had carried the Imperium this far. Action was always easier than contemplation, and the Great Crusade offered action without end. Yet the silence never vanished entirely. It lingered in memory, in the awareness that between each triumph lay vast stretches where certainty dimmed and questions went unvoiced. The Imperium continued forward, radiant with purpose, but also accompanied by these unspoken reflections, drifting like faint echoes between the stars, unheard by most, but never truly gone. In the years that followed, the Great Crusade no longer felt like a blazing dawn, but like a sun climbing toward its zenith, bright, powerful, and increasingly difficult to look at directly. Its light reached farther than ever before, touching systems whose names had never been spoken on Terra, yet that very brilliance cast longer shadows behind it. Supply lines stretched across spiral arms, fleets operated months apart from their nearest allies, and decisions of planetary consequence were made by commanders who would never stand in the Emperor's presence, yet acted in his name with unwavering conviction and resolve always. Within this vast design, Horus continued to serve as a living bridge between distant Terra and the advancing edge of human expansion. His counsels were measured, his judgments deliberate, and his presence carried a reassurance that statistics alone could never provide. Officers who left his strategium often spoke of renewed clarity, as though the burdens of command had been redistributed simply through being heard. He did not rule through fear or cold abstraction, but through a sense of shared endeavor, reminding each legion of their triumphs were threads in a single, immense tapestry still being woven across the stars together. Yet as responsibilities accumulated, so too did the need for delegation. Sub-commanders were granted wider authority to interpret broad directives, and entire sectors were stabilized without direct oversight from the Warmaster himself. This was not negligence, but necessity. The Crusade scale had outgrown any single vantage point. Still, with each layer added between decision and origin, understanding became more dependent on trust than on immediate knowledge. Most of the time, that trust was justified. The Imperium functioned, world was secured, and the forward motion of history appeared undisturbed to observers both near and impossibly far away at that time still. For the Primarchs, long campaigns apart from one another subtly altered the nature of brotherhood. Once reunited in wonder and fierce loyalty, they now knew each other increasingly through reports, delayed astropathic messages, and rare grand musters where strategy outweighed sentiment. Respect endured, but familiarity faded at the edges. Each son of the Emperor ruled his legion like a sovereign realm within a greater empire, shaping doctrine, culture, and honor codes according to personal conviction. Diversity strengthened the Crusade's adaptability, yet it also meant that unity depended more on agreement of purpose than on shared daily experience with one another. Among mortal institutions, the strain showed in quieter, more bureaucratic forms. Administrative envoys argued over tired classifications, logisticians revised rejections as new Crusade routes opened, and colonial charters were amended to match shifting strategic priorities. None of this carried the drama of orbital assault or heroic last stands, yet these documents determined whether newly compliant systems thrived or faltered. Delays could mean shortages, and shortages bred unrest that required further intervention. Thus the Imperium's advance fed upon itself, each success generating new obligations that stretched resources thinner than official proclamations ever admitted in the quiet margins of reports and ledgers. Even the imperial truth, so confidently proclaimed, encountered realities that did not fit neatly within its rhetoric. On frontier world where survival had depended upon shared ritual and inherited myth, the sudden insistence on purely secular order felt less like enlightenment and more like erasure. Compliance authorities moved carefully, often preserving harmless customs while discouraging those deemed obstructive. Officially, such compromises were transitional steps toward full rational unity. Unofficially, they created cultural undercurrents that imperial doctrine did not fully map, layers of identity that persisted beneath the surface of public conformity quiet, enduring, and largely unmeasured by census records tallies. Still, few would have described the era as troubled. To most who served, these complexities were signs of growth, not decline. The Imperium was learning the shape of itself, discovering through action what no plan could fully anticipate. Confidence remained the dominant note, reinforced by the continued absence of any foe capable of halting the Crusade's advance for long. Each challenge overcome seemed proof that humanity's resurgence was not merely possible, but destined, guided by intellect and will rather than by superstition or chance. Voices of caution existed, but they were soft and easily set aside in brighter hours' triumph. In private moments, however, individuals sometimes sensed that the Crusade had become too vast for any single story to contain. A compliance that fell just on one world could feel harsh on another. A strategic withdrawal that saved a sector might doom a distant outpost. These contradictions did not halt the advance, but they accumulated in memory, small weights carried silently by those who made such choices. No formal doctrine addressed this burden. It was born as part of duty, folded into the larger faith that the Emperor's vision justified every necessary cost without hesitation or expectation of recognition later. So the Great Crusade pressed on, magnificent and unrelenting, its fleets like sparks cast from a central fire that still burned unseen on distant terror. Those who served believed they stood at the turning point of history, participants in a transformation that would render the long night a fading memory. They could not see how scale itself was changing the nature of their endeavor, how distance and delegation were reshaping loyalty into new and untested forms. For now, there was only forward motion, and the quiet certainty that dawn, once risen, could never truly set beyond the farthest horizons ahead. By the time the Great Crusade had spanned a significant portion of the galaxy's spiral arms, its existence felt less like a campaign and more like a permanent condition of human life. Generations were now being born on worlds that had never known isolation, growing up beneath the double-headed aquila as a symbol not of conquest, but of normalcy. For them, the Imperium was not a promise of reunion, but the simple fact of existence. They studied histories that spoke of old night as distant tragedy, scarcely imaginable compared to the ordered present they inhabited. This normalization carried quiet consequences. What had once inspired or gradually became expectation. Compliance fleets were welcomed as representatives of a familiar authority rather than as harbingers of a transformative new era. Administrators implemented policies with the confidence of precedent, and planetary governors learned to frame their ambitions in terms aligned with imperial structure. Stability, hard-won in earlier years, began to feel self-sustaining, as though the machinery of unity could run indefinitely without fundamental change. At the highest levels, however, leaders understood that such stability was a product of constant effort. The Warmaster and his strategists tracked not only external threats, but the internal balance of resources, morale, and communication that allowed the Imperium to function. They knew that the Crusade's pace could not slacken without risking fragmentation, yet maintaining that pace demanded ever greater coordination. Each newly compliant sector brought fresh responsibilities: defense grids to maintain, trade routes to secure, populations to integrate into the wider economic and political order. Horus carried these burdens with a steadiness that inspired confidence across the fleets. He spoke often of destiny, not as mysticism, but as a natural outcome of humanity united in purpose. Under his guidance, legions that had once operated largely independently now coordinated more frequently, sharing intelligence and supporting one another's campaigns across sector boundaries. These joint operations reinforced a sense of shared mission, reminding all involved that they were parts of a single, immense enterprise whose scale defied ordinary comprehension. Yet destiny, when spoken of too often, can begin to sound like certainty. Among officers and iterators alike, language shifted subtly from aspiration to assumption. Victory was not merely hoped for, but expected. Compliance was not a question of if, but when. Such confidence reduced hesitation and drove remarkable achievements, but it also left less room for doubt, for the possibility that events might unfold outside established patterns. Plans grew more ambitious, timetables tighter, as though the future were a landscape already surveyed and mapped in full. Far from the centers of command, on remote outposts and newly established colonies, the Imperium's presence could feel distant despite official unity. Garrison forces maintained order, astropathic relays flickered with intermittent contact, and supply convoys arrived on schedules vulnerable to warp delay. For settlers on these worlds, life was shaped more by local conditions than by distant proclamations. They believed in the Imperium, yet their daily reality depended on small communities and immediate leadership. Unity, at such remove, was an article of faith sustained by trust rather than by constant reinforcement. The legions, too, felt the effects of this widening dispersion. Some spent years campaigning in regions far from their brother formations, developing specialized tactics suited to local conditions. Environmental warfare on death worlds, void engagement against nomadic fleets, prolonged pacification of densely populated hive systems. Each theater demanded adaptation. These experiences enriched the Imperium's collective military knowledge, yet they also deepened the distinct identities of individual legions, emphasizing what set them apart even as they served the same overarching goal. Throughout all of this, the Emperor remained a distant, guiding presence. His grand works on terror continued beyond the sight of most, their details known only through brief, formal communications. To many, this distance enhanced his stature, elevating him beyond ordinary leadership into a near-abstract embodiment of human destiny. Devotion to his vision remained unwavering, yet personal understanding of his immediate intentions grew thinner with time. The Imperium functioned increasingly on inherited trust, sustained by the momentum he had set in motion. In quiet moments, some among the Imperium's servants sensed a paradox at the heart of their age. Humanity had never been more united, yet never more spread out. Authority had never been more clearly defined, yet never more dependent on interpretation across distance. Confidence had never burned brighter, yet it relied on structures stretched across light years and maintained by fallible hands. These thoughts rarely altered behavior. Duty and belief carried the day. Still, they lingered like faint stars visible only when brighter lights dimmed. And so the crusade continued, guided by conviction that history itself moved in harmony with the Imperium's advance. Each system brought into compliance seemed another confirmation that destiny favored unity. Fleets translated onward, banners unfurled against alien suns, and the great endeavor pressed forward with undiminished resolve. Yet beneath the certainty of progress, the true shape of that destiny remained unseen, waiting beyond the next horizon, patient and unmapped. As the Imperium's borders expanded into regions once marked only by speculation, the nature of discovery itself began to change. Early in the Crusade, each new system had been a revelation, a fragment of lost humanity, or a fresh challenge demanding decisive action. Now, discovery carried a quieter tone. Many worlds resembled those already brought into compliance, their cultures' variations on familiar themes of survival, adaptation, and cautious hope. This familiarity reinforced the belief that history followed patterns the Imperium had already learned to master. Yet the galaxy was never entirely predictable. Beyond well-charted corridors, exploratory elements sometimes encountered phenomena that resisted easy classification. Derelict structures of uncertain origin drifted in silent orbits. Star systems bore signs of abandonment without clear cause. Signals echoed from deep space, repeating sequences that defied immediate translation. Such findings were logged, studied when possible, and often bypassed in favor of more strategically valuable objectives. The Crusade's momentum left little time for mysteries that did not directly threaten compliance or offer immediate advantage. Among those tasked with analyzing these anomalies, a subtle unease occasionally surfaced. Scholars and tech adepts understood that humanity's knowledge, though vast compared to the long night that preceded the Crusade, remained incomplete. They catalogued inconsistencies in stellar cartography, irregularities in warp behavior, and artifacts whose functions could only be guessed at. Officially, these were puzzles to be solved in due course, reminders that the galaxy's history was deeper than any single species. Unofficially, they hinted that not all forces shaping the present were visible to Imperial design. Within the legions, such concerns rarely reached a level of open discussion. Space Marines were trained to confront tangible threats, not abstract uncertainties. Still, reports of strange encounters circulated through informal channels. Void ships found adrift with crews missing, battlefields where enemy formations had collapsed without visible cause, regions of space where Auspex returns seemed distorted. Each incident had a plausible explanation, yet their accumulation contributed to a quiet awareness that the Crusade moved through a cosmos more complex than its doctrine suggested. Horus addressed these matters with characteristic balance. He neither dismissed anomalies outright nor allowed them to divert the Crusade's primary objectives. Specialized attachments were assigned to investigate when feasible, and findings were shared among relevant commands. His approach maintained confidence while acknowledging uncertainty, reinforcing the sense that the Imperium could face any challenge through reason and coordination. To those under his command, this steady pragmatism was another sign that the right leader had been chosen for an era of such immense responsibility. Even so, the sheer scale of operations meant that many events unfolded beyond immediate oversight. A delayed report from a distant sector might arrive months after its relevance had passed. By then, local commanders had already acted according to their best judgment, shaping outcomes that would be accepted as fait accompli. This decentralization was unavoidable, a natural consequence of galactic reach. Yet it also meant that the Imperium's narrative of steady, unified progress was built from countless independent decisions, each influenced by local pressures invisible at higher levels. Among civilian populations, awareness of the wider galaxy remained limited. Most citizens knew the Imperium through the presence of administrators, the teachings of iterators, and the occasional spectacle of a visiting warship. Rumors of strange discoveries or unexplained losses rarely traveled far beyond those directly involved. Life continued in fields, factories, and hive districts, shaped by immediate concerns rather than distant mysteries. The Imperium's promise of stability held firm, even if the universe beyond its borders remained largely unimaginable to those it protected. In quieter circles, however, some began to reflect on the nature of destiny itself. If the galaxy held remnants of civilizations older than humanity, if the warp concealed forces not yet understood, then the future might not be a simple extension of present success. These thoughts were philosophical rather than subversive, expressions of curiosity rather than doubt. Still, they suggested that the Imperium's story, however grand, unfolded within a broader tapestry whose full pattern no single species could claim to control. The Crusade continued regardless, driven by schedules, supply chains, and the unwavering belief that unity was both necessary and achievable. Fleets moved with practiced coordination, legions executed campaigns with disciplined precision, and new systems were added to imperial charts with steady regularity. Yet as the stars ahead grew denser and stranger, the sense emerged, faint but persistent, that the Imperium advanced not only into empty space, but into histories and forces that had been waiting long before humanity's return. These murmurs in the vast did not slow the crusade. They lingered at the edges of awareness, like distant signals just below the threshold of clarity. For most, they were curiosities, footnotes to a narrative of triumph. But they were there, woven into the background of an age that believed itself enlightened, reminders that even at the height of confidence, the galaxy remained deeper, older, and less noble than any empire could fully comprehend. The farther the Great Crusade stretched into the galaxy, the more the line between certainty and conjecture began to blur. Systems once isolated and hidden in the dark arms of space were now brought into the fold, yet with each addition came complexities unforeseen in initial planning. Worlds were rarely simple. Their histories, geographies, and inhabitants carried patterns of survival and belief that did not always align neatly with the Imperium's expectations. Success depended not only on force, but on the careful calibration of understanding, diplomacy, and oversight, a balance as delicate as any physical maneuver in the void. Horus, as Warmaster, remained the steadying axis around which the operation turned. He monitored campaign progress across countless sectors, weighing reports with the precision of one who understood that numbers alone did not convey the texture of reality. Field commanders described conditions, victories, and losses, yet beneath those words lay layers of circumstance invisible to even the most seasoned eye. The Warmaster had learned to read between these lines, to perceive nuance in phrasing and tone, and to anticipate consequences that statistics could not measure. His authority, while immense, was exercised with careful attention to both immediate effect and long-term implication. Primarchs commanded their legions with similar diligence. Each son of the Emperor bore the weight of an entire civilization's expectations, tempered by the unique character of his legion. Strategies were adapted not only to enemy presence, but to local terrain, climate, and social structure. Decisions had to account for unforeseen variables, the loyalty of local leaders, the resilience of hidden populations, or the subtle resistance of traditions centuries old. Even when battle was decisive, the true challenge lay in shaping victory into lasting compliance, ensuring that a planet's addition strengthened the broader tapestry rather than introducing unintended instability. Civilian administrators and iterators, operating alongside military forces, contributed to this intricate process. They translated the imperial truth into practical governance, measured resources, and managed populations whose custom could not always be reconciled with the ideology of unity. On some worlds, compliance was immediate and thorough. On others, it required delicate negotiation, careful scheduling, and repeated demonstration of the Imperium's benevolent yet undeniable authority. These efforts rarely made the records of heroic feats, yet without them, no campaign could claim enduring success. Victory alone was insufficient. Stability required constant attention and quiet oversight. Even within the disciplined ranks of the legions, small divergences began to emerge. Each Primarch's personality shaped not only strategic doctrine, but also the culture of his legion. Some emphasized meticulous planning and measured restraint. Others favored aggressive action and improvisation. Differences were subtle yet influential, producing variations in conduct that, while complementary in many cases, hinted at the complexity inherent in a galaxy-spanning operation. Leadership, no longer centralized in a single presence at every frontier, depended increasingly on interpretation, trust, and judgment exercised at vast remove from terror. The warp, too, remained an unpredictable force beneath the Crusade's forward motion. Navigators guided fleets through current invisible to normal perception, yet storms still arose without warning, altering schedules and stranding vessels far from their intended destinations. Such disruptions forced commanders to exercise autonomy in critical decisions, at times for months before directives could be confirmed or adjusted. The Imperium had grown adept at such contingencies, yet each delay carried risk, each adjustment a possibility of unintended consequence. Even success required constant vigilance. In quieter moments, observers of the fleet noted that the galaxy beyond imperial charts carried its own memory. Ruins of civilizations far older than humanity remained scattered across forgotten worlds. Patterns of settlement, architecture, and technology hinted at histories unrecorded by even the most thorough archives. These remnants were catalogued and studied when time allowed, often reduced to abstract curiosity, yet their presence reminded all who noted them that the universe had been shaped long before the Imperium's return, and would continue to exist in forms beyond its immediate control. Despite this, the Crusade pressed onward, radiant and unbroken in its public face. Fleets translated seamlessly from system to system, legions executed campaigns with precision, and new sectors were folded into imperial administration with impressive efficiency. Every decision, every allocation of force, and every diplomatic choice carried the echo of past judgment, the weight of present responsibility, and the anticipation of future consequence. The scale of the operation created both confidence and quiet tension, a constant interplay between order achieved and the immensity still unexplored. And so the Imperium advanced, its light reaching farther than ever before, illuminating worlds long lost to memory. Yet as the Crusade extended its reach, small, unspoken questions lingered at the edges of perception. Could unity hold across such expanse? Could distant judgment remain consistent with central vision? These queries were subtle, easily dismissed amidst the certainty of victory, but they existed nonetheless. And in that space between achievement and doubt, the Imperium continued its relentless march, its triumphs luminous, its shadows growing ever fainter, yet never entirely absent. The Imperium, in the midst of its relentless advance, appeared outwardly flawless. Fleets glided between stars, banners gleamed in the light of distant suns, and report from compliant worlds spoke of prosperity and loyalty. Yet beneath this surface, subtle variations began to ripple through the fabric of the Great Crusade. No empire, regardless of size or intent, could expand across a galaxy without encountering the quiet friction of difference. Worlds were not uniform. Cultures, languages, and histories persisted in ways that resisted full assimilation. Even within the legions, unity was tempered by personality, experience, and circumstance. Harmony was real, yet inherently fragile, a melody whose minor notes hinted at unseen tensions. Horus, in his role as Warmaster, sensed these undercurrents more keenly than most. Command reached him from every theater, its cadence unbroken yet complicated by distance and the limitations of communication. Reports were complete yet inherently filtered, shaped by what commanders deemed necessary to emphasize or omit. Decisions, therefore, required not only strategic skill but interpretation, an understanding of context, temperament, and potential consequence that exceeded simple calculation. To balance the weight of empire, Horus applied judgment not only as a measure of necessity, but as a reflection of experience, tempered by caution and guided by unwavering faith in the emperor's vision. The Primarchs themselves mirrored this complexity. Each commanded his legion with an authority rooted in personal origin, creating variations in methodology that, while effective, introduced subtle divergences in operational culture. Some legions move with meticulous precision, emphasizing discipline and calculation over improvisation. Others acted with dynamic force, embracing initiative and adaptation as core to success. These differences were rarely problematic in direct engagement, for the legions complemented one another across theaters of war. Yet they demonstrated that even in service to a single objective, the interpretation of orders, principles, and purpose could diverge. Harmony, therefore, was a careful and conscious construction, reliant on trust as much as law. Beyond the military sphere, civilian populations also contributed to the subtle friction shaping imperial cohesion. Newly compliant worlds varied in their capacity for integration. Some adopted imperial governance with remarkable speed, embracing stability it offered after centuries of isolation. Others resisted change in quieter ways. Traditions persisted beneath surface compliance. Local leaders negotiated autonomy within prescribed limits, and cultural memory endured as a form of silent opposition. The Imperium, through iterators, administrators, and bureaucrats, worked to guide these populations gently but firmly, aware that the true measure of conquest lay not in occupation but in sustained alignment with the Emperor's vision. Even as the Imperium expanded, the warp remained an unpredictable companion. Navigators steered vessels across invisible currents, yet storms could rise without warning, delaying fleets or scattering detachment across sectors. These disruptions necessitated autonomous judgment at every level, testing commanders' adherence to broader strategy and their capacity to act in isolation. Each autonomous decision, Though executed in accordance with purpose, carried risk. A misjudgment could ripple outward, affecting supply, morale, or planetary compliance. In this environment, responsibility was inseparable from opportunity, and the measure of leadership was tested not only in triumph, but in the handling of uncertainty. Horus understood this intimately. His guidance sought to provide clarity without stifling initiative, a delicate balance designed to maintain cohesion across an empire whose reach often outstripped immediate comprehension. By reinforcing trust, rewarding initiative, and calibrating oversight to suit circumstance, he ensured that the legions remained aligned even as individual commanders made independent judgments. His presence served both as anchor and as conduit for the Emperor's authority, translating distant intent into practical direction, ensuring that the crusade moved forward not as disjointed campaigns, but as a coordinated, purposeful expansion. At the same time, the scale of conquest invited reflection. Veterans of long campaigns considered the nature of their achievements, the countless worlds unified, the populations restored or reorganized, the conflicts resolved. Yet even in their reflections, questions emerged, subtle but persistent. Were all choices entirely just? Were all actions necessary? And in the distance beyond reach, what remained unknown and what consequences would follow unseen? Such thoughts did not hinder action, but they were carried quietly, forming a subdued awareness of the crusade, for all its brilliance, advanced into a galaxy both ancient and indifferent to human purpose. Within the legions, discipline remained absolute, yet experience fostered a deeper understanding of consequence. Officers learned that the smallest decisions, left unchecked, could shape campaigns for decades. Soldiers internalized the weight of command in the calm before engagement, in the quiet moments of transit when no orders were issued and only the stars observed their passage. The galaxy was vast, yet every human decision mattered within it, a ripple across currents that could never be entirely foreseen. And so, the crusade continued, brilliant in its outward certainty, yet carrying within it subtle variations, minor frictions, and the quiet weight of countless decisions. The Imperium advanced relentlessly, unified yet complex, disciplined yet dynamic, achieving victory while slowly sensing the limits of coordination across distances beyond imagination. For now, harmony held, delicate and carefully maintained, but in the soft spaces between light and action, the universe whispered that no empire, however luminous, could entirely escape the consequences of its own scale. By this stage of the Great Crusade, the Imperium had reached a scope that few could fully comprehend. Fleets numbered in the thousands, each carrying thousands more soldiers, support personnel, and vital equipment across light years of uncharted space. Worlds were systematically catalogued, surveyed, and brought into compliance with remarkable efficiency. Yet the very magnitude of the crusade created vulnerabilities invisible to the casual observer. Coordination, though maintained with impressive skill, depended on a fragile lattice of communication, trust, and judgment. Each node in this network, each commander, each primarch, each administrator, was both essential and irreplaceable, their decisions carrying consequences that could amplify or undermine imperial unity across entire sectors. Horus, as Warmaster, moved through this web with measured attention. He balanced the competing demands of hundreds of concurrent campaigns, weighing the priorities of planetary compliance against the need for resource allocation and legion support. Reports flowed to him from every corner of the galaxy, yet he recognized that numbers alone could never convey the full reality of a situation. The tone of a report, the subtle hints buried in language, and the absence of detail often revealed more than what was explicitly stated. Reading between the lines became a critical skill, one that separated merely competent command from true mastery of empire. The Primarchs, for their part, were acutely aware of the expanding autonomy their legions now required. Time and distance meant that orders could not be micromanaged, and discretion became as important as obedience. Some legions embraced structure, executing campaigns with relentless precision and careful adherence to doctrine. Others adapted fluidly, improvising tactics in response to unique local challenges. In both cases, success was achieved, yet the diversity of approach underscored a fundamental truth. Unity was not the absence of difference, but the alignment of purpose despite it. Civilian administrators faced similar trials. On newly compliant worlds, they balanced the demands of imperial law with the practical realities of local populations. Infrastructure had to be rebuilt, resources managed, and social hierarchies reconciled with the Imperium's ideals. Subtle resistance persisted in some regions. Traditions, beliefs, and loyalties that could not be erased overnight. Iterators and envoys worked to temper these tensions, framing the imperial truth as both guidance and promise. The appearance of harmony, though carefully maintained, was therefore an ongoing effort, a continual negotiation between aspiration and reality. Even the warp, that constant companion of interstellar transit, continued to challenge the Crusade's rhythm. Navigators guided vessels through the ever-shifting Imperium, yet storms arose unpredictably, scattering fleets or delaying critical reinforcements. Decisions made in isolation, often by commanders thousands of light years from any direct oversight, became necessary and unavoidable. Each choice, though grounded in training and doctrine, carried weight beyond the immediate theater of operations. A misstep could reverberate, affecting supply lines, planetary security, or the cohesion of multiple legions operating in tandem. Within the legions themselves, discipline remained unwavering, yet experience had bred caution tempered by foresight. Officers reviewed potential outcomes before every engagement, considering not only the tactical result but the implications for planetary stability, population loyalty, and long-term strategic positioning. Soldiers internalized the responsibility of their actions, understanding that each skirmish, patrol, or siege contributed to the larger pulse of imperial order. That pulse, though confident, remained fragile, a galaxy-spanning system held together by calculation, intuition, and the enduring belief in a vision larger than any individual mind could hold. Horus carried this awareness constantly. His guidance sought to harmonize these countless threads of command, ensuring that victories were not fleeting and that compliance endured. By fostering initiative among his officers while reinforcing alignment with overarching strategy, he preserved both flexibility and cohesion. Yet even he understood that the scale of the Imperium had begun to create gaps between intent and execution. These gaps, though small, reminded all who led that perfection was impossible, and that even in a system built upon order, the potential for fracture could never be fully eliminated. Across the void, civilian populations, soldiers, and administrators alike came to recognize the magnitude of the enterprise in which they participated. The Imperium's light extended farther than any human mind had yet imagined, illuminating planets long hidden in darkness. Compliance brought security and stability, yet the sheer breadth of governance meant that subtle inconsistencies persisted, quietly shaping the Imperium from within. In these spaces between order and action, the galaxy revealed itself not as a single monolith of power, but as a complex, living system where every choice resonated, every decision mattered, and every individual contributed to the fragile pulse of unity that sustained the Great Crusade. And so, the Crusade continued, magnificent in its scale and seemingly unstoppable in its purpose, yet conscious of the delicate interconnections upon which all success depended. Fleets advanced, banners flew, and victories were achieved across countless worlds. Still, beneath the brilliance of progress lay the quiet truth. The Imperium's harmony, though strong and unyielding in appearance, relied on the careful balance of innumerable choices made every day across the vast and indifferent expanse of the galaxy. As the Great Crusade pressed onward, the vastness of the galaxy began to assert itself not only in distance, but in the experience of isolation. Fleets that once traveled in relative proximity now spanned light years from one another, their mission stretching across regions so remote that coordination required patience measured in months rather than days. Each legion, each detachment, and even the smallest contingent of administrators and envoys operated under the weight of autonomy, tasked with translating imperial will into practical action without immediate oversight. The bonds of unity remained strong, yet the distance imposed a new awareness that leadership, however capable, could not be omnipresent, and that success depended as much on interpretation and judgment as on obedience. Horus, ever vigilant, monitored the crusade with both authority and attentiveness. He received reports that carried victories, setbacks, and anomalies, each filtered through layers of command and context. The Warmaster understood that the numbers, though reliable, conveyed only a fraction of the truth. He studied subtle patterns in communication, delays, omissions, and variations in phrasing that hinted at difficulties not fully described in official dispatches. In these quiet assessments, he discerned the pulse of the Imperium, noting not only where systems prospered under imperial guidance, but where minor tensions began to emerge, discrepancies that, while inconsequential individually, suggested the first signs of strain within an empire of unprecedented scale. The Primarchs faced similar realities. Each legion functioned as both an instrument of war and a microcosm of governance. Decisions once easily transmitted from central command now required judgment and adaptation at every level. Some Primarchs emphasized rigorous procedure, ensuring that operations proceeded in strict accordance with doctrine. Others trusted their officers' initiative, allowing flexibility to respond to the unpredictable conditions of war and settlement. These differences, while subtle, reflected the individuality of each Primarch in the legions they led, contributing to the diversity that made the crusade effective but also complicating the notion of absolute uniformity. Civilian administrators and planetary governors bore their own burdens. They implemented imperial policy across worlds newly brought into compliance, often balancing local customs with the demands of efficiency and loyalty. Populations, while outwardly obedient, occasionally resisted in muted ways. Minor infractions, preservation of traditions, or subtle defiance in private spaces. These deviations were rarely serious, yet they reminded officials that the Imperium's reach, no matter how expansive, did not equate to complete control. Governance across such distances required constant vigilance and an understanding that human behavior, even under strict authority, could not be entirely predicted or directed. The warp remained both a tool and a challenge, guiding fleets across distances beyond natural comprehension, yet remaining unpredictable in its flow. Storms arose without warning, scattering ships, delaying convoys, and forcing commanders to make autonomous decisions with incomplete information. Each choice carried risk, yet it was unavoidable. Fleets could not halt, and the crusade momentum demanded adaptability. Those who navigated these passages learned patience, endurance, and the necessity of trust. Trust not only in one another, but in the unseen currents of space itself. Even victory depended upon harmony with forces beyond human command. Within the legions, the isolation of campaigns fostered reflection. Veterans considered their role not only in the act of conquest, but in the maintenance of civilization itself. Every skirmish, patrol, or engagement contributed to the larger tapestry of imperial order. Soldiers internalized the weight of responsibility, understanding that their actions had consequences far beyond the immediate battlefield. The scale of the operation magnified every decision, reinforcing the principle that discipline alone was insufficient. Judgment, foresight, and awareness of context were equally essential to sustaining the Crusade's momentum. Horus maintained a steady influence amidst this vast isolation. Through councils, correspondence, and presence where feasible, he ensured that the legions, administrators, and envoys remained aligned with the Emperor's vision. Yet he recognized that the Crusade's true challenge lay not in force of arms, but in sustaining coherence across distances where neither oversight nor immediate guidance could always be applied. Autonomy was necessary, yet it introduced subtle variations in execution and interpretation. Harmony, therefore, became a carefully nurtured condition, maintained through trust, guidance, and the shared understanding that the crusade was larger than any single mind or command. Even in the calm of warp transit, the sense of isolation persisted. Ships drifted between stars, their crews aware that they operated in spaces beyond immediate recognition, guided by training, faith, and the distant authority of leaders who themselves could only guess at the circumstances they would encounter. The galaxy, vast and indifferent, reminded all that while the Imperium's light was expansive, it did not illuminate every corner, nor could it fully predict the responses of those it brought into its orbit. And so, the crusade moved forward, radiant in its purpose yet conscious of the silent spaces between action and command. The Imperium expanded relentlessly, and while victories multiplied, the awareness of isolation, subtle variation, and the fragile complexity of coordination grew in quiet parallel. Within these silent reaches, the galaxy whispered of depth and unpredictability, a gentle reminder that even the most luminous and disciplined empire moved through a universe both vast and unknowable, where every decision, every choice, carried weight beyond immediate perception. The Imperium, at the height of its expansion, had become a vast lattice of governance, force, and belief, stretching across star systems that had not seen human hands in countless generations. Fleets carried legions from one end of the galaxy to the other, each campaign coordinated with precision that belied the scale of the endeavor. Worlds were brought into compliance, populations integrated into the rhythms of imperial life, and the authority of the Emperor extended further than any single observer could fully appreciate. Yet with this unprecedented reach came an awareness, quiet yet persistent, that the sheer scope of the crusade introduced uncertainties beyond calculation. No empire, regardless of strength or purpose, could anticipate every eventuality when its influence spanned light years. Horus, the Warmaster, continued to carry the weight of this knowledge with unwavering composure. Reports reached him from every sector, describing victories, complications, and anomalies, yet each communication was inherently partial. Some details were delayed by the vast distances between worlds. Others were omitted by the limits of perception or judgment. Horus read not only the words themselves, but the space between them, understanding that subtle nuances often reveal more than the explicit facts. He guided the crusade not through force alone, but through interpretation, balancing knowledge, intuition, and experience to ensure that the Imperium moved as a unified whole. The Primarchs, each commanding their respective legions, experienced this threshold of uncertainty in their own ways. Time and distance demanded that autonomy become an operational necessity. Each legion adapted to the challenges of its assigned theater, interpreting orders in light of local conditions. Some Primarchs relied on careful procedure and rigid oversight, ensuring consistency across campaigns. Others entrusted their officers with discretion and initiative, allowing rapid response to unforeseen developments. These approaches, while both effective, demonstrated the subtle fractures inherent in managing a galaxy-spanning operation, unity achieved through shared purpose, yet nuanced by the individuality of those tasked with executing it. Civilian administrators faced similar trials across newly compliant worlds. Governance, resource management, and population integration required constant attention. While some populations accepted imperial authority readily, others adapted more slowly, clinging to pre-existing traditions or local hierarchies. Iterators and envoys worked tirelessly to reconcile these differences, framing the imperial truth as both guidance and promise. Success was measured not only by obedience, but by the endurance of stability, the quiet compliance of everyday life, and the ability of local systems to function without direct oversight. Each choice, no matter how minor, contributed to the broader coherence of the Imperium. The warp continued to remind all who traveled it of the unpredictability inherent in the crusade. Navigators guided ships along invisible currents, yet storms could arise without warning, scattering fleets and delaying vital reinforcements. In these conditions, decision-making became autonomous, relying on the judgment and experience of those present. Errors were inevitable, though often correctable. The very necessity of independent choice reinforced the understanding that no empire, however vast, could exercise absolute control across the immensity of space. Risk and uncertainty were inseparable companions to progress. Within the legions, discipline remained absolute, yet awareness of consequence deepened. Officers trained for decades carried the understanding that every maneuver, every choice in battle, had ramifications far beyond the immediate field of conflict. Soldiers internalized this responsibility, knowing that even small deviations could shape planetary compliance or the outcome of extended campaigns. The Crusade's success depended as much upon judgment as upon strength, and as campaigns lengthened, this understanding became ingrained across every rank. The pulse of order required constant attention, and its maintenance was both subtle and pervasive. Even Horus, whose guidance had unified the legions and coordinated countless campaigns, recognized the limits imposed by scale. Authority was vast, yet interpretation remained necessary at every level. Harmony was sustained not by decree alone, but through trust, training, and alignment of purpose. The Imperium's victories were therefore as much a product of the wisdom exercised in countless decisions as they were of force or technology. Leadership, in this context, was the ability to perceive, anticipate, and harmonize countless threads moving independently yet toward a common goal. And so, the crusade moved ever onward, brilliant in its accomplishments yet shadowed by the unspoken understanding of limits. The Imperium's light spread across star systems, illuminating worlds long abandoned to darkness, yet each advance carried with it questions that could not be answered by strength alone. Even as fleets marched, legions conquered, and administrators guided populations, the threshold of uncertainty remained, a quiet reminder that the galaxy, immense and indifferent, could always produce forces beyond comprehension, events beyond calculation, and consequences beyond intention. In this space, the Imperium continued, radiant and determined, yet moving through a universe that had never been entirely predictable and never would be.